Good morning, everyone, and we welcome you all to Ortho TV Online. And to introduce today's speakers and the topics, I hand over to Dr. Rakesh from Sanofi.
Thank you. Hello and warm welcome to everyone. And good morning on a beautiful Sunday morning. Uh, Sanofi, in addition with Ortho TV, welcomes you to this webinar on orthoplasty of knee and shoulder. And to talk on this topic, we have today India's one of the finest orthopedician. First speaker for today's morning session is Dr. Ravi Sahuta sir, who is a director and HOD at Trauma Recourse Center and Chief of Adult Reconstruction and Pelviacetabular Surgeon at Artemis Hospital, Gurgaon. Sir is also a very known orthopedician in the north part of India, and also one of the finest speaker and much sought after clinician. And along with him, we have Dr. Kushal Mishra sir, who is director Director of Joint Replacement and Orthopedics at Fortis Escorts Bone and Joint Institute. So I welcome our speakers, Dr. Ravi sir and Dr. Mishra sir. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your expertise today with us. With this, I would like to hand over for the first session to Dr. Ravi sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rakesh. Thank you, Dr. Neeraj and Ortho TV. Today, we will be looking at which is rather uncommon topic. Basically, it talks of arthroplasty in a neuropathic knee joint, which is a bit controversial, and we'll be going ahead with certain evidences and what precautions we need to take for those patients who are disabled by this kind of a issue. So, as far as the Charcot joint concerned, basically, neuropathic joint was described way back in 1868 by Charcot as a sequelae in a patient with the neurosyphilis, we call it Tabes dorsalis. And similarly, peripheral diabetic association with the neuropathic effects was created by Jordan in 1936, and way back in 1831, Michael was correlating the neurology with the joint involvement. As far as the neuropathic joints are concerned, basically they are a challenge for the orthopedic surgeons. As far as the literature is concerned, it is limited, and management is also little complex and difficult, and there are certain contradictory views. So we'll attempt to summarize the evidence concerning arthroplasty and in the Charcot, a little bit about pathophysiology, because that has a certain bearing that would guide how we really manage these patients and what stage of the disease we need to manage. So in order to understand pathophysiology, basically it is still fully not understood, but there are these two major theories, which are French theory and the German theory. The French theory talks of osteopenia associated with the autonomic dysfunction, increases the blood flow, decreases the sympathetic tone, and also damage to the trophic centers, ultimately leading to perfusion and increase in the temperature. Whereas the German theory talks of basically micro trauma, which is due to the repetitive stress activity, as there is a decreased nociceptive response. And this micro trauma leads to increased inflammation and thereby leading to bone resorption. Charcot joint is likely to result from concomitant sensory, motor, and autonomic neuropathies. However, there is a third component of the theory where these both theories, German and French theory, are combined, where they talk of motor neuropathy leading to instability, and autonomic neuropathy causing resorption and subsequent osteopenia into the bone. Beside tertiary syphilis affecting the knee joints, these are other various conditions like leprosy, alcoholism, syringomyelia, lacunar infarct, cerebral atrophy. Also, these days we see more and more patients of diabetic peripheral neuropathy. There may be knee joint involvement and idiopathic kind of a situation. As far as the demography is concerned, basically, in this, the underlying cause this of involvement, especially in Tabes dorsalis, knee is involved. When we look at the patients of syringomyelia, generally and elbow is involved, and in patients of diabetic neuropathy, foot and ankle involvement is more common. 7% of the patients of diabetes will have a neuropathy, and about 4 times increase happens in those patients where there is concomitant peripheral neuropathy. Majority of these patients have about 64% of them have a feet involvement. About 0.4% may have a knee joint involvement in diabetics. As far as the signs and symptoms are concerned, this is generally described what they call a painless arthropathy. Basically, there could be a pain occasionally, and there could be a which is because of the muscular and a bone damage. The edema, inflammation, and raised joint temperature is generally in the early stage of a Charcot or acute stage of a Charcot involvement. And Charcot joint can cause, there are what they call 3 stages to this particular disease. The first phase of the disease is known as a developmental phase. These next 2 are basically coalescent phase and a reconstructive phase. In a developmental stage, there are increased redness, hot, and there could be edema and swelling at the joint, whereas temperature gets better, and also reconstructive phase improves the bone healing. As far as the investigations are concerned, in this subluxation is very of the bone, and there could be a destruction which is clearly evident, and presence of a periarticular bone formation in a later stage of a disease, and a deformity instability is very classical. So these are classical traits which you would find in most of these patients who present to us with the Charcot arthropathy. As far as the investigations are concerned, destruction of the periarticular fragments is seen in a developmental phase. Bony debris can be seen absorbed. Sclerosis is evident in coalescent phase. And when you look at the signs of a fusion or a new bone formation, this is seen in the reconstructive phase. It is very important to understand these 3 phases, because management would depend on the stage of the disease. And staging, natural staging was, Sheholz gave the classification which talks for stage 0, stage 1, and stage 2 and 3. In a prodromal stage, that is stage 0, generally it can only be detected with a bone scan. We may not find a lot of changes on the X-ray in this early stage, whereas in development, there could be acute inflammation of the joint. There may be even dislocation. In phase, there are fine bone debris which you can see segments around. As far as construction is concerned, in the stage 3, there is a consolidation and remodeling, and a new which can be. This classification also helps us by the treatment, because it guides us. If there is an initial phase, one can give a rest. In a prodromal stage, one can just education of the patient is important. As the developmental stage is concerned, some protective ways to immobilize the joint, and some prefabricated bases can be used, or supports can be used. And in coalescent phase, total contact casts and bracing is important. As far as the reconstructive phase is concerned, in this phase, one can venture the surgical intervention. As far as the CT and MRI are concerned, they do not add too much in the significance of disease. However, MRI would help us if there is associated, because there is a differential diagnosis which overlaps as far as the symptoms and the presentation is concerned in the form of osteomyelitis. There could be a tumor or trauma and osteonecrosis that may be overlapping. However, when you do the biopsy, it is very, very classical. In the synovium, there will be embedding of the cartilage and bone fragments, which is very classical of the histological appearance. So initial treatment generally in phase prodromal and at stage 1 and in fact stage 2, the treatment primarily depends on non-weight bearing bracing, and also one can use augmented movements with the help of a supports, casts or total contact casts, and these days there are very good pneumatic braces which are available, which can be used effectively. However, non-weight bearing is required for a good 3 months or so before it moves on to the next phase, next stage of the disease. Protection is required in this first phase. It is also been seen that bisphosphonates and injection of zoledronic acid very effectively modifies the progression of the disease and probably to some extent slows down the acute phase or a first stage of the disease, and this reduces the temperature as early as 2 weeks and is very helpful in initial stage of a management. As far as the arthrodesis is concerned, this was a standard treatment. However, achieving arthrodesis is technically difficult because there is a severe instability, soft tissue laxation, and a bony destruction. So, and arthroplasty is highly risky. So, good olden days when there were no facilities, or in fact, arthrodesis could also be a salvage procedure if there is a fear of arthroplasty in a given situation. Surgical treatment basically in arthrodesis, what is done is after thorough debridement, which is performed, the removal of the patella and synovium is completely excised, because that help decrease the inflammation at the site and decrease the various inflammatory cells, and also it poses the vascular barrier between the bony fragments which are healed. Immobilization with the intramedullary implant, which is very effective, and cartilage and sclerosis so we have to be careful that in arthrodesis, cartilage needs to be removed, sclerotic bone be removed, and intramedullary is helpful, and this needs to be protected. In a given study, about 9 out of 10 patients did well, and there was minor infection, and nail was broken in the given situation. Looking at the arthroplasty choices in a Charcot joint, it is basically big challenge for the orthopedic surgeon. However, it is not an absolute contraindication for as far as the arthroplasty is concerned. Degree of a joint destruction determines the difficulty of the operation and also the success of the operation. Milder the deformity, there are fewer the complications, and in an advanced stage, if the destruction is too much, in that case, surgical intervention is the only option, because patients generally get disabled and incapable of doing their independent activities. Shear's classification in a stage of a disease when there is a cessation of a destruction or a final radiological stage of a reconstruction, and that is when one should venture in interfering in such a joint, because if you do anything before at the time of first 2 stages, there could be a very high risk of dislocation, and periprosthetic fractures are very common. Arthroplasty should be only considered in a patient who is showing radiological signs of a bony reconstruction. There are certain advantages of arthroplasty. Patient get pain relief, functional outcome is better, patient becomes relatively independent, and the range of motion of the joint can be improved. As far as the pain relief is concerned, about 90 to 90% of the patients do have an improvement in their symptoms, and severity of the pain drops 10 to 1. As far as the functional outcome is concerned, in patients, there is a significant improvement and a post-operative score, almost all types they do. Range of motion definitely becomes better, joint becomes stable, and at times early stage of a recovery, bracing required, but later on they do not even require a bracing and independent walking possible. If the alignment is done very well, patella needs to be positioned centrally because there is a destruction. So joint line must be maintained exactly where it has to be. Because of the bone loss, one could actually construct tibia to the lower level or a femur to the higher level. Generally, it is the tibial site which is most damaged. That is the loading site which gets affected. And so it is very important that one has to be careful about the alignment of the limb and proper positioning of the prosthesis in the limb. So alignment, as far as alignment is better, so it adds to the good stability, and the longevity of the prosthesis is determined. So alignment increases the longevity and stability. At the same time, most of the case series have shown improved alignment, and pre-operative alignment. Generally, we aim between, as far as the varus is within 9, as far as the valgus is concerned, about 6 degrees, and by and large, you do not increase the valgus more than 7 to 8%, 8 degrees in these situations. Walking freedom, these patients initially sometimes may require a gradual rehabilitation. Walking is possible, stable joint which is reconstructed, and that is probably the aim of a surgical intervention in these patients. This is a case where there is extensive damage into the intra-articular area, and one can see the reconstruction with the constrained implant which was done, where it is very important that in a constrained implant, one must add the sleeves or the stems to the implant so as to there is a very high level of stresses which are generated across these area, so as to prevent early loosening of these implants. This is another case where one can see the amount of a destruction. Generally, these patients come walking. They have a reasonable instability. Sometimes they use a support or a brace, and they are practically pain-free. So this is how the X-ray was seen, and one can see the destruction of the tibia and extent of the destruction in the proximal tibia, which is almost going to the metaphyseal area. This is the surgical picture, intraoperative. Adequate exploration is done in these situations, and proper debridement is done. When you look at the histopathology, as I told you, that synovium is embedded with the bone and the cartilage fragments. Similarly, in this particular case for us, fortunately, because destruction of the femur was not very extensive, so the joint line, we knew exactly where we need to reconstruct our joint. After the thorough debridement, it should be that the synovium and other tissues are completely excised. I do not prefer to really do the patelectomy generally, because after you debride everything around the patella, especially synovium and other things, it fares reasonably well. And reconstructing the doing the patelectomy hampers the rehabilitation in these patients. These are the further stages of a reconstruction, and this is final stage after reduction of the replacement. And this side is you can see the trial, and the other side you can see the final processes which has been fitted in. And this is how operatively it looks, and reasonably stable. And this was the patient pre-operatively showing her gait and pain. If you see her face, she's not in very much pain, but she's weight bearing reasonably with a very bad limp. And this is a post-operative reconstruction. One can see the good full extension in the situation. Her gait has improved significantly, and also there is a good range of motion. As far as the technicality is concerned, one must discuss the patients because these are technically challenging reconstructions, and outcomes are also at some point of a time little less predictable, and the possibility of a failure is very high. Sometimes ends up into arthrodesis and even amputation for the patients. As far as standard use of antibiotic and thromboembolic antithromboembolic agents is concerned, they should be given in these patients. Bony defects and extensive bone fragmentation, which can be associated with joint, which presents in almost 90% of patients. So if there is an extensive defect, these bony defects needs to be filled up either with the help of a metal or with the help of various augments which are available. So realignment and ligament balancing at times in an early stage when there is not too much of a destruction. In that case, it is possible. However, quadriceps mechanism may need lateral release, and sometimes tibial tuberosity transfer may be warranted. Post-operative bracing may be required, and a range of motion of exercises are done. As I told you, that quadriceps rupture or the failure of a quadriceps mechanism is very common, and complete synovectomy should be done. Choice of the implant. So processes, choosing a prosthesis is definitely a challenge. It depends. At the back end, mostly we keep almost everything ready from a non-constrained to semi-constrained implant, because sometimes you may be caught on a wrong footing depending upon the extent of the debridement which may be required in a given situation. So you should be reasonably prepared. But as far as the condylar prostheses are concerned, they can also be done in certain situations. But Parvezi says that less constrained devices can lead to symptomatic instability, because sometimes the disease also progresses and the instability also works. On the other hand, Kim has warned that very high constrained implants cause early loosening, and aseptic loosening is very, very common at the bone cement interface. So customized augmentation of the prosthesis can be done in a situation depending upon the severity of the defect in the bone. Generally, patella is replaced in the situation. As far as the complications are concerned, these are about 50% of the patients present with complication, remarkably high in these patients. Subsequent surgeries, about 15% of patients end up with instability may be seen because of the syphilis, as ataxia and other symptoms, they deteriorate these patients. Dislocation is again very common, about 7% of these patients. Patella generally dislocates. Tibiofemoral dislocations are not that common, but they do happen. Periprosthetic fractures are very common because the sensitivity around the joint is very poor, and losing and instability can occur. This is a case where lateral replacement was done, and about a year back, and patient within 2 months presented with the history of arterial fall, and then it was intra-articular periprosthetic fracture with the loose, where reconstruction was not possible. Patient had no pain and was walking, and in this case stability was there. So sometimes these patients, they present even after these injuries. And this particular patient, when the reconstruction was done later on, she presented to us with again a trivial fall. Patella got dislocated laterally. Now you can see the patella, which is completely. So this was revised with the mega prosthetic replacement with the sleeves on either side. And then she had again trivial fall where she dislocated her patella, and now she's not interested in getting anything done. However, she is able to walk independently, but there is flexion instability, obviously, because of the extensor mechanism is completely disrupted. As far as the deep vein thrombosis is concerned, about 8% of the patients, they may suffer from the DVT, and disruption in the quadriceps mechanism and deep infection could be seen in few of these patients. Intraoperative repair and requirement of immobilization may be there. There is enough literature today to suggest that whatever we are talking, it is reasonably justified, and arthroplasty can be given to these highly disabled patients with a strong disability, strong instability at the joint, and these are actually patients who are incapacitated to do their day-to-day activities otherwise independently because of the joints which are very badly damaged. And also if we do not take care of these joints, since they are painful, they keep walking and damaging the bone further and further, which makes reconstruction technically more difficult. Even the orthosis is very challenging. So it is very important that we give something for the interim period, at least till such time. So these patients have more than 5 to one patient is about 8 years follow-up, and a few of them are more than 5 years follow-up. They're doing reasonably well. So diabetics could be having these symptoms of neuropathy. And also we have to be aware that there is a very, very high risk of a failure. So these surgeries are technically challenging, and I told you that we have to do a good alignment and a balancing. And as far as the prosthesis is concerned, we have to have all range of semi-constrained to fully constrained implant. In fact, at times the customized implant may be required in these days because the facilities are available. So as the metallurgy and biomechanics and understanding of availability of a prosthesis is concerned, with the time as these things are improving, we are able to take more challenging cases for reconstruction. Charcot joint should not be considered as an absolute contraindication for arthroplasty. Thank you very much for your attention. Dr. Neeraj, over to you. Hello? Hello? Yeah, Dr. Rakesh?
Thank you so much, sir. That was an excellent presentation. And hello? Yes, sir. Can you hear me, sir?
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I have a few questions for you.
Yeah.
When you operate on these neuropathic joints, don't you have the fear that the wounds may not heal or the wounds may gape and then it will become infected? Because that is my biggest fear for operating on any type of neuropathic joint, whether it is a replacement or an arthrodesis.
Generally, if we are in a right time operating these patients, when the joint has become very quiescent, the initial phase of a turmoil which is happening in the joint, and in a knee, especially when you are going below the knee, the peripheral, beside the neuropathy, peripheral vasculitis, vasculopathy is also another issue. So we have to be little careful choosing these patients right. And not all the patients have a healing issue. See, diabetics and vasculopathy have a more complication, more issues. But when we are dealing with idiopathic patients, one of the patient was about 25 years, came from J&K and was suffering with a lot of pain. We didn't know why she had this type of presentation, and there was no option. So these are the patients where wound healing is not a problem at all. So probably you have to choose which patient you are dealing with. Generally, if the knee is reconstructed, in knee, healing is not a very big issue. And also, not all the patients are diabetics. Not all patients have, vascular issues. So I think those patients who are smoker, high risk patients who are having a vascular issues, those and uncontrolled diabetes and so forth are probably at relatively high risk of a complication, infection, and at the same issues. Fortunately, we didn't have big issues with the healing of the wounds in our cities.
Do you give prolonged antibiotics in these type of patients?
Yes, generally we give antibiotics for at least till removal. Yes.
Okay. And what about the post-op rehab? Is there anything special which we need to look out for?
Generally, we have to be little careful. We can't allow them immediate full weight bearing, independent weight bearing, because they have to actually, the other tissues have to learn learn that judgment, the amount of a strain in this. So if the joint is reasonably inherently stable with the help of a hinge or something like that, then it's not a very big issue. But in a joint where we are reconstructing with the semi-strained situations like big pegs and things like that, or these patients require bracing post-operatively and a gradual rehabilitation over a period of next few weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, and then relatively independent. And we also tell them that they have to be very careful that periprosthetic fractures are very common in these patients because they do not have that sensation, which feedback sensation, which generally is a protective mechanism for most of us.
Is there any medical management role on neuropathic joints?
Yeah, we did discuss that use of bisphosphonates is very important, and operatively most of our patients are on either yearly injection or oral bisphosphonates, which we tend to put them on for first 2 to 3 years.
So is there any role of collagen or vitamin D3, pre-operative or post-operative?
I probably do not know major role of these. There is I don't think there is a major support of the literature, but yes, as far as the healing is concerned, one can use supportive drugs in an initial phase probably, but post-operatively, I don't see collagen products or collagen peptides have got a major role. Probably in an initial phase or a prodromal phase, yes, or a stage 0, what we call. In that case, use of collagen peptides in the form of undenatured collagen peptides, because they do have a certain role to play as far as the preservation of the cartilage is concerned, and the destruction of the cartilage activity, degeneration of the cartilage is concerned. And also vitamin D at baseline is very important, because see, this also causes deficiency of the vitamin D, also causes muscular imbalances and muscular instability. So there is evidence that using a vitamin D has a certain role to play.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
We hand over the proceedings to Dr. KK Mishra, and he is going to talk to us on reverse shoulder arthroplasty. And I hand over to Dr. Rakesh to introduce Dr. KK Mishra.
Sir, we have introduced at the session only, start of the session only. So, sir, direct over to you, sir. Dr. Mishra, sir.
Dr. KK Mishra, we'll have to stop the screen share and start the screen share again with the full screen.
Is this fine?
No, you'll have to stop the screen share.
Okay.
And when you click on screen share, the first one which all the videos are seen, double click on that screen where it is written on the bottom screen, that one.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
You can start the slideshow.
This is fair.
Yes.
Yes. So you'll have to go on the
First slide, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome, friends. I am presenting one latest, or we can say the new addition to the joint replacement field. It is not very uncommon, but yes, it's not very common also. The shoulder replacement. We all know that knee replacement followed by hip replacement followed by shoulder replacement. It is already only less than 10% people need shoulder replacement, and of this, we know there is a role of hemiorthoplasty, anatomical shoulder, and reverse shoulder. Reverse shoulder is the latest addition to the field of joint replacement, and I'm not saying it's very rare surgery, but very few surgeons used to do this surgery, and I am presenting that only. So the main indication for reverse shoulder orthoplasty is any condition in which your abduction mechanism of the shoulder is gone. It's because of cuff tear, it's because of osteoarthritis, it's because of fracture, it's because of failed fixation, it's because of anything in which your abduction mechanism of shoulder is gone. We can choose the reverse shoulder orthoplasty. And one more situation, if you have got proximal shoulder tumor, you can choose the reverse shoulder orthoplasty. But the only limitation of this reverse shoulder orthoplasty is that your deltoid must be functioning, because the whole outcome of surgery is going to be depending on how is your deltoid and how well you have preserved the deltoid during the surgery. Most of the time when we do the shoulder surgery, and most of the people, I also use the deltopectoral approach, and surgeon knows that at least initial anterior 1/3 of the deltoid may damage during the surgery. And that is the basically the most important limiting factor for any good surgeon. And in my opinion, each and every fiber of deltoid is very important if we are going for reverse shoulder replacement. So few anatomical basic things that show your head of humerus should be retroverted around 30-degree, glenoid retroversion 7 to 10, 7-degree retroversion to 10-degree anteversion, neck shaft angle 130. This is very basic. This is the first design shown by Gormont, and basically Gormont was the person who basically gave the concept of reverse shoulder orthoplasty, and the basic on the basis of and his experiments, he decided to have the principle of rotation, constraint fulcrum, and lowering humerus just to increase the deltoid tension so that the deltoid fibers and deltoid can proper way. If your rotator cuff mechanism is gone, you can see this is your length of deltoid is minimal, center of rotation is here. After doing the reverse shoulder orthoplasty, you can see the length is like this, and the center of rotation shift to the medially. And this is how, by physics principle, that torque is force into length, and deltoid start working in absence of any rotational or any abductor mechanism. So this is the same thing which I try to explain. One more thing everybody should know who is planning to do, because this is the main concept. When there is a destruction of the abductor mechanism, loss of rotator cuff, failed fixation or anything, then and even in anatomical normal shoulder also, only this portion you can see, this segment of deltoid work as abduction. And after doing the rotator reverse shoulder replacement, what happens if we shift the center of rotation from this place to medial side like this? The most of the means at least more than 60% deltoid work for abductor mechanism, and that is the basic for any reverse shoulder replacement. These back fibers who are on the around, in normally it is around 40% is for the extension and 20% is for the forward flexion, and only resting fiber is for abduction. But after doing, you can see 50% fibers are for the abduction. That is more important. And if after medialization, you can see there is always if there is basically a normal shoulder, there is force, it pushes to normal shoulder to medial side, and basically uh, uh, eliminated when we do the reverse shoulder. And how it works, the normally when normal shoulder is there, there is always a gliding, sorry, there is always movement. But if we are doing shoulder mechanism, there is gliding as well as sliding, and that is how your shoulder abduction becomes very normal. So these are some basic facts. Everyone is trying to go for a shoulder or in early phase, they must know. And this torque mechanism increases, and this is center of rotation, and because of pull even, the abduction is okay. So, but disadvantage with this medialization, that the base of your cup touches your scapular neck, and it causes notching. To avoid this notching, it is prescribed that shift your little bit down so that this margin of your glenosphere comes below the neck of scapula, and there it should be at least little bit angle. It should not, it should be 5-degree downward tilted. To method avoid the notching. Now this is the surgical steps. I just wanted to go directly to my video presentation, which we shoot, and this is normal position in beach chair with the free shoulder. I used to pull the shoulder and scapula out of the table, or we can remove the table just below the chest. This is position, and now I am going to my presentation.
सर आप वीडियो ओपन कर लीजिए, फिर उसके बाद शेयर स्क्रीन करिएगा।
अभी शेयर नहीं हुआ?
नहीं सर, अभी तक नहीं हुआ है सर।
जस्ट होल्ड ऑन,
फिर से अनशेयर कर दीजिए सर।
ओके, स्टॉप शेयर
करना या पूरी स्क्रीन शेयर करना सर?
जस्ट वन।
स्क्रीन पे क्लिक करके
एक सेकेंड। Is it okay now?
No, sir. We can't see. नहीं sir. हाँ
अभी
अभी
तो
हो रहा
अभी हो
है.
गया.
Yes.
So we start with the deltopectoral approach. This is basically the landmark for coracoid process. We follow the deltopectoral approach and we can release up to your need and requirement. It's not that you up to the insertion of deltoid. And now identify the pectoral major tendon here. And this is pectoralis major tendon, which identified proximal 1/3 to 50% you can release for better exposure. And retractor is applied. And we can see this conjoint tendon. We can put one Hohmann just above the coracoid process. It is very safe practice and no need of giving big and long incision because it's free muscle and we releasing basically the joint medial lateral to the coracoid process. Now you can see just basically the ligating anterior circumflex vessels. This is very important. Just hold on. Okay. Is it okay? And now I was at this point only. We put the two stay sutures at the circumflex humeral vessels. We are basically performing the subscapularis sternotomy right now after putting the stay sutures on that. And try to gradually dislocate the neck of head of shoulder. It's exactly similar as we do in the hip joint, coming down to the neck, releasing, and unless we are on the bone, we are not going to do anything. So now after putting the retractor, humeral retractor, we leave the superior glenohumeral ligament, intermediate glenohumeral ligament, and inferior glenohumeral ligament. And we have to basically between the capsule muscle. If we are between this plane, we are not going to damage either axillary nerve or any vessel. And it's a very important step because what happened, the capsule get adhere with the subscapularis muscle just to release that for better movement and stability of the reverse shoulder or even in anatomical shoulder also. This is a very important step to release from the subscapularis muscle. It is more important in anatomical shoulder. Now we are going for glenoid exposure. We have to remove the capsule, labrum, ligaments, glenohumeral ligaments, small amount of synovium also. We have to remove everything, and we should be on the bone only to provide just to basically prevent any damage to the nerves. inferior capsular release is important, but be very sure about release, be on the bone, because just below this, the axillary nerve passes. So this is very danger area, but if you are on the bone, you're not going to damage basically the axillary nerve. So after releasing this, we are going for humeral preparation. Till the humerus, it's the same whether we are going for anatomical shoulder replacement or shoulder replacement. Head of humerus is delivered, putting all the human all around. And we must insert basically the starter on the top of the head, highest point. No need to choose anywhere else. Just go the top of the head and just insert it. Start preparing the canal. Depending on size of canal, we can put the basically cutting guide. There are different company has got different type of cutting guides. It basically you have to go on whatever the company you are using. And it's better that we should not remove whole of the head first go. Usually in anatomical shoulder, we cut at from the neck and whole head is out. But in the shoulder, it's better that we should remove less than 50% or up to 50%. Like this. Then start reaming. It's basically depending on which design you are using. So this is trial reamer. Depend medullary canal size, we have to choose the trial stem. And it's always better after this process, leave the trial implant inside, because when we are going to dislocate the humerus for exposing glenoid, usually retractor causes crushing. But if your design is not okay, then you may not leave the basically the implant, trial implant, and then you have to. And sometimes what happened, this margin got crushed due to retraction. And just to avoid this, I used to leave the 50% of the head. Even if we have got crushing, done some crushing of the proximal humerus, better. Now we have to put the guide, glenoid guide. And at this point, you have to see your guide should be coming big neck, just to avoid notching, which I told in my presentation. Then start reaming. At this step, usually we damage the head of the humerus. So that is why if you have extra, it is okay. Then it is basically base plate. And mention. And we have to put basically the proximal and distal screws first. It's important to put distal screw first, followed by the proximal. But these two, it's totally depending on surgeon's choice whether they are putting locking or screw. I prefer to use these two locking, but the locking must not be done before putting anterior and posterior screw. No locking. We have to stop at stage. Now proximal. And this should direct it to the coracoid. You have to put your finger to feel the base of coracoid, and then direction can be decided. But basically target area is your base of coracoid. And this should direct towards the neck. But before locking, we should put anterior and posterior screws, and they must crisscross like this, like this. And these screws are usually compression screws, so that the base plate gets seated completely on the glenoid. You can see the direction. It is going down like this, and anterior one is like this. And after full compression, first we lock the inferior, then superior. This step used to give that 5-degree tilt to avoid notching. This creates basically the fixed angle device. Now we put the glenosphere. Impaction, then putting a screw for glenosphere. Now humeral component insertion. There are two designs basically, cemented and uncemented. This is presentation for cemented. And we are just putting bone block, cement restrictor. And at this time only, we should put stay sutures in. Basically, it is a subscapularis insertion, and it is to the bone also. The proximal humeral, not very strong bone, so we can pass the needle even, and we can put 2 or 3 sutures. It is not important if we are doing the reverse shoulder for the movement, but if we have resting rotator cuff, it's better that we should try to repair it as much as possible. It usually provides a better stability to reverse shoulder also. Now we are doing the cementing. After completely drying the humeral canal, and we insert the cement. We can choose your own method, whether you put a liquid phase or you put a solid phase. You choose something depending on your choice. Then at this time, the version is more important, and it should be around 10 to 20 degree external rotation to the forearm, just to give anti-version. Now put trial. Depending on which size your reduction is more stable, you can choose your trial. But before cementing completed, you can put any size spacer just to make the cement get set. After setting of the cement, deltoid tension should be checked, and trial spacer should be checked, and then you can choose the size. It is medium, normal, large, extra large, 2 mm, 2.5 mm, 5 mm, 0. And that for the stability, it should not be very loose. It should not be very, very tight, but it must be firm. Your reduction should not be easy. That is the basically key for your success of reverse shoulder. And just to judge how much stiff your reduction should be. It should not be very hard, and it should not be loose at all. It should be firm. And we are just repairing the subscapularis. It is not needed for rotation. It is not needed for movement, but it is better to repair it for basically stability of hand. I think rest all is just a closer, which is not very important for all the surgeons. So I am stopping share. Yes, this is how I used to do the reverse shoulder, and any question on floor is invited.
Yes, Dr. Sauta, you can ask. Just unmute yourself.
Okay. So, Dr. Mishra, if there is inadvertent loss of a wall of glenoid, what is the bailout?
I used to, if we have time, I can put my presentation, so case presentation, in which I used to take bone graft, and if our proximal bone, humerus bone, I don't prefer that bone because bone is very weak.
Very weak.
So it is always written in the books that you take cancellous graft from proximal humerus and put it, but I am not very happy with that. So I always put graft from iliac crest, it provide proper base. I don't favor that cancellous bone graft from proximal humerus. It's better crest graft.
Somehow I find especially if there is AD with a very small stature, the glenoid is not very reasonably big, and we have implants which are bigger size. Even the smallest size of the implant which is available, I find it quite big for Indian stature women.
Yes, it is very common problem. I haven't used any base plate more than medium because too large for all the Indian continent. But yes, most of the time we use basically the small size base plate. That is the only way out. What is available that we can use. But I don't want to name the company, but there is one company who has got the larger as well as a smaller implant also. So we choose that. But the question of your is very important. That always we have seen in the books, in all the presentation, they always try to encourage to take the graft from proximal humerus and put. It is very for Indian women and males. It is very flimsy.
It
is not. Yes. So it's better that we take the tricortical graft from iliac crest, put it completely on the glenoid, and then we should not rely on the proximal humerus cancellous graft.
Then you build it up. You fix it up first, and then you build it up.
Yes.
Problem is that there is very limited, it only gives one chance to put things in the right place.
Sir, if we are putting glenoid augmentation or glenoid bone graft, it's better to select the revision base plate, not the normal base plate. In the revision base plate, you have got option, and that is better when you are using bone graft or any bone graft.
Okay. Thank you.
Any questions, sir?
Okay.
Yes, 100%. Most of my cases, in which there is comminuted fracture, even and age is more than 65, I prefer to use the reverse shoulder than fixation. Frankly speaking, for past 4 years, I haven't done any hemiorthoplasty. of reverse shoulder only. And there are latest basically results are coming in which the short term, mid results are there. If they are favoring reverse shoulder even above the anatomical shoulder. There is no long-term data available, means more than 15-year data is not available, but the less than 15-year data comparing anatomical shoulder as well as reverse shoulder, the reverse shoulder is on the better number than the anatomical shoulder. And most of the people think that in reverse shoulder in young population is risky, but Mark Frankel, who is basically shoulder, I did my fellowship with him, and he says that there is no anatomical shoulder, it's just reverse shoulder. He used to put all the implant only, no anatomical shoulder implant. So, and the latest upcoming report are also suggesting that he is right, that anatomical shoulder has got better long-term outcome than, reverse shoulder has got better results, better long-term result, means up to medium-term results are available and are better or comparable to the anatomical shoulder. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. 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 My preferred model, I have used Zimmer, I have used Johnson and Johnson, I have used Evolutus, but frankly speaking, I am very comfortable with Evolutus. The reason probably is that it is a cheap implant, okay, and I have used maximum this implant, so it is very friendly to me, very even I have got the design. If you want, you can see, this is basically, if everybody can see, this is the cemented Evolutus stem. It is trauma stem. We can see there are holes, but I have maximum used the uncemented. Uncemented Evolutus is much stem. Whether we take Zimmer, we take Depew, the uncemented Evolutus is best in my hands, I can say. And this is how, and it is very simple. They have got this small mechanism of which you can put anterior, inferior, or superior, and can change this offset very easy, like this. If you are putting like this, same if you put down, offset is. So it's very handy and very easy. This is one. And if you are doing reverse shoulder, the same cup is available, same type of mechanism. If we are putting down, your offset is less. If we are putting the up, offset is more. So, opinion, whatever implants are available, I can say very good in my hand.
Have more options with this implant. I think
yes,
definitely better in the given situation. What about, is there any experience on unique use in a situation?
Unique shoulders.
Yes.
Unique shoulders. I've used it, but not very successful.
Why do you say
that? Because I have used it around to 15 cases, and 5 cases got revision.
Any reason for that?
I don't know. Maybe I am not so expert on using this.
Probably we not have a very big series.
Yes.
Definitely, wherever we have used, we have been successful. It is very quick surgery, very limited intervention, and
yes,
you just go repair around the. Is very important. Probably to me, again, the problem is the same as I told you. Fixation is the issue. Variation is there, and you can't fix them in a proper position distally. So distal, you have to just push, just
yes,
hang it up inside. Yes. And as a trauma surgeon and a
yes,
hesitant in, leaving
Yes.
it like that.
That is why all the places where this is required, and age is more than 50, 55, 60, means comminuted head fracture, I use reverse shoulder.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Neeraj, over to you.
Yes. What about the post-op rehab?
Post-op rehab?
How fast do you start them mobilizing in abduction?
Okay. What I used to tell my patients, that all the movement below shoulder height is allowed after 3 weeks. Initial 3 weeks, the pendulum movement, but most of the book says complete immobilization for 6 weeks. I have never done the 6 weeks immobilization. 3 weeks immobilization depending on pain. Pendulum exercises starting as soon as possible. Active pendulum movement and below shoulder movement up to 1 month, and after till 1 month to 6 weeks, I always say just hold from the other hand and take it up like this. Means passive movement above the shoulder after 3 weeks, and before 3 weeks below shoulder movement, and active movement above shoulder only after 6 weeks.
Can I ask you one more question?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir,
Yes,
go
please.
ahead.
How do you really protect your patients? Do you give them, because these patients who are elderly, they are like in a trauma situation, Dr. Neeraj was asking, and prefer to do a reverse shoulder. These are reasonably osteoporotic skeletons. So do you give them a post-operative teriparatide or something to improve their quality and other things? Or you
I always tight over bisphosphonate. I very rarely use bisphosphonate, and if basically I go for after bipolar or hip arthroplasty or knee arthroplasty or shoulder arthroplasty, before that we go for BMD. If the two-side BMD, mainly hip and spine, is showing osteoporosis, not osteopenia, I used to start teriparatide. I rarely use bisphosphonate.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Dr. Neeraj.
Yes, I think that's all for now, and we thank Dr. K.K. Mishra and Dr. Ravi Sota to share these very nice and good videos of the surgeries which they have performed. They are not so commonly seen, and it was really a good thing, and it will remain on Ortho TV for a long time, and people will be coming and revisiting these surgeries again and again whenever they do a neuropathic knee or a reverse shoulder. And we also thank Sanofi for supporting us during these webinars. We thank Dr. Rakesh and Dr. Isha Ramaya, and to mention that Sanofi is the maker of Depura, Depuracal and Colaflex Pro Plus. So we thank everyone and hope you have a nice Sunday and enjoy your time with your family.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neeraj.
Thank you.
Dr. Devi, and thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sanofi. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Dr.
everybody.
and Dr. Lee, for your time and for your valuable experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Isha, and thank you, Dr. Rakesh. And thank you, Dr. Ravi,
Thank
and
you.
Dr. Neeraj also.
Yeah.